Amazingly enough, we're still on time after one panel. Usually conferences like wars go awry as soon as you have first contact, but we're actually on time, and we'll endeavor to stick to that. So that will require me to be at least as stern a sergeant major as Professor Enbar was. So I'm Austin Long. I'll be chairing this panel as well as speaking briefly at the conclusion. I'm an assistant professor here at Columbia School of International and Public Affairs. I'll really quickly introduce the panelists in the order they'll speak. First, Hillel Frisch, who's an associate professor at Bar-Ilan. Hillel is also a graduate of SIPA as well as doing his PhD at Hebrew University. He writes on a variety of Middle East issues. His most recent book is on the Palestinian military. Next will be Professor Gary Sick, who teaches here at Columbia as well, where he's also a senior researcher. Professor Sick has a long and storied career in the Middle East, as Professor Quant mentioned, going back to his time in the Navy and on the National Security Council under Presidents Ford, Carter, and Reagan. He's also written 2 books on Iran and the United States' relationship with Iran. And then finally, Professor Enbar, Ephraim Enbar, is the director of BESA. He's written innumerable articles and several books on Middle East security issues. And his experience goes back to his time as an IDF paratrooper. So I think we should have a pretty wide array of viewpoints on the panel. I asked the speakers to hold it to 15 minutes or less. It will not be less, I'm sure, but nonetheless, we'll allow plenty of time for Q&A. Thanks.
It's really a thrill to speak in a place where you graduated from, and I really had a great time here, and it was very, very intellectually rewarding. I hope that you'll feel that I'm providing the fruits of that kind of education. I'm going to be speaking about 3 issues. One is Egypt's prospects. How does that impact on the Gulf? And what should be done in terms of the United States national interests? Now, I think that it's very, very important to stress and focus on Egypt, not to be waylaid by events in Libya. Egypt is the key to understanding how events are going to unfold. Now, we're very early on in the process. Forecasting is a very difficult job. As Anna Arendt commented on professional revolutionaries, usually when revolutions break out, it catches them unaware in the coffee shops. And we had a wonderful example of that. There was the immolation of this Tunisian man in a forlorn Tunisian town, and that set off and triggered this whole process. Well, we've had 40 immolations and attempted immolations since, and none have triggered the same effect. So it's very hard to forecast, but we have at least 2 bodies of literature in which we could get a sense of how events in Egypt are going to play out. One is the literature on democratization, on democratic transitions. The second literature is on revolutions. Basically, in democratization literature, suggests that the more top-down process-wise, the larger the middle class structurally, the more bloodless and successful the transition to democracy. Egypt does not satisfy either of these 2 conditions. It wasn't a top-down process in the way, for instance, that Taiwan or South Korea were, which were successful transitions. It was a revolution from below, and the middle class is not that large. And that in itself is disappointing news to fully gauge a successful or to predict a successful transition. The lessons from a revolution are even more lugubrious. Generally, in revolutionary situations, it's the meanest, the ugliest, the smallest, and the most organized that hijack revolutions and take over power. It was the Jacobins who produced the guillotines in France that won out when they were a minority against the royalists and the liberals. It was the Bolsheviks who took over from the Mensheviks, the Social Democrats. And in probably the most pertinent example for Egypt, the Iranian Revolution, it was exactly the same thing. The revolution began as a middle-class protests in liberal Iranian universities, and they were hijacked by the Islamic militants. In fact, we should remember and recall the fate of Pashur Bakhtiar, the first prime minister after the fall of the Shah. This man was a professor of political science. His French was better than his Farsi. He had sideburns which were in style at the time. Well, he was used and abused and then discarded, and then in 1991 was murdered by the Islamists in his French exile. And if that's not enough, let us reflect on Mehdi Bazargan, who was an Islamist scholar. He wasn't murdered, but was totally marginalized, and we've been living with the effects of that revolution ever since. When I was reading the New York Times on Egypt, I kept on reflecting on how little the New York Times has learned since the last round of promise in Iran. Now, why should I think that it's the Iranian precedent that fully reflects potential developments in Egypt? Well, let me give you a couple of indications why I think that that it's the Iranian way that will play out. If we look at the 2005 elections in Egypt, which was the last semi-free elections, how many Muslim Brotherhood members secured seats in the Egyptian parliament? 88. All the four opposition parties, the other four opposition parties garnered 7 seats, a ratio of 11-1. In other words, they're not only the meanest, the ugliest, the most organized, but they're numerically significant as well. Now, there was an article by Scott Atran in the New York Times where he claimed, no, the Muslim Brotherhood is not that strong. Maybe only 20 to 25% of the Egyptian electorate support them. But it's not the absolute power that you wield in revolutionary situations. It's the balance of power. Now, what happens in there'll be free elections out there in a year's time. What happens in the first elections after the downfall of regimes, even in the most successful cases? So I looked at Poland and I looked at Hungary. Do you know how many parties contested the Polish elections in 1990? 75 parties. I repeat, 75 parties. In Hungary, 50 parties. Now, when you think of an Egyptian voter after a year of instability, and every day in Egypt, I'm not being waylaid by Libya. I keep on reading Al-Aram and the postings in dialect Egyptian and in Arabic, and every day there is a major crisis of instability, strikes by organized groups, the burning of police stations by former undercover detectives, the burning of churches, sectarian crisis, every day, in and out, this feeling of instability is increasing. Now, the average Egyptian voter is going to come to the voting booth in a year's time, and he's going to be tired of that instability, and he's going to see a roster of parties, the Muslim Brotherhood, which he knows since 1928, and 50 other parties. And he's dying for stability. He or she, who is he or she going to vote for? They're going to vote for the Muslim Brotherhood, not out of love, but out of hope that maybe the Muslim Brotherhood will give them stability. It's even worse than that. The Muslim Brotherhood has a fantastic strategy. They announced that they won't be part of any government until the elections. Why is this brilliant? Well, because expectations during revolutionary situations increase, but capabilities decrease. Every successive government, including the military, their luster dims. And I want to tell you, in the postings to El Aram, they keep on talking about where is the military? Where is the military? Why aren't they defending these police stations and all, and preventing massacres of a village, which took place 2 weeks ago, when criminals descended on a village and killed 23 people. They decided to try defending themselves, and they were slaughtered. Meanwhile, as the luster of all these governments, technocrats, and luminaries that might join the government dims, by the time elections take place, there will be only one group whose luster still remains intact. That's going to be the Muslim Brotherhood. Now, why, I get to the second part of my speech, why is Egypt so important? I'm going to give you an argument that Egypt is the major Arab Sunni state, and that basically the Arabs finally re-entered history after 800 years of losing history to the Turks, to Turkic-speaking and Farsi people. It's not known, but they ruled over most of the Arabs since the fall of the Abbasid Empire, and even way before that, in the 13th century, have been ruled by non-Arabs. It was Jamal Abdel Nasser who brought back, in a very problematic way, the Arabs into history. Well, now, with the potential disintegration of Egypt, the Arabs might be receding once again from history before the ascendance of the two kinds of peoples who ruled over them for 800 years, the Iranians and the Turks. Now, this will increase the propensity of the Gulf states to what's called in IR theory bandwagoning with the Iranians. What is bandwagoning? It's exactly what King Hussein did in 1967 with Jamal Abdel Nasser. Jamal Abdel Nasser tried on frequent occasions to kill King Hussein. But when push came to shove, in May 1967, King Hussein wisely decided that it was better half a kingdom than no kingdom at all. They knew that the Israelis would overrun Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, within 2 days. But they felt that if they wouldn't bandwagon with Jamal Abdel Nasser, they will be left without a West Bank and an East Bank. Hungary, Romania, during the Second World War did the same thing. The fall, or the potential disintegration of the strongest Arab Sunni state will have a dramatic resonance on these states that could be called walkover states, because all these states could be walked over, the Gulf states, by any real military power. Now, why is bandwagoning of Gulf states, the potential, such a problem? And I argue it's a problem because Egypt, if it comes under the sway of the Muslim Brotherhood, there's no way that Iran alone can refinance or can finance the remilitarization of Egypt. But the Gulf states, under pressure of Iran, could possibly bring this about. And this would completely change the power balance in the Middle East. There's no way even the United States could live with a remilitarized Egypt. Even the European community that has tried forgetting what war making is all about will find it hard to deal with a state that might remilitarize with Gulf state financing. And of course, there's the oil problem, which the Gulf states, which any kind of bandwagoning of the Gulf states with Iran will be very threatening. So what has to be done? And that's my third and final comment. The first thing is that Europe and the United States should as much try to politically organize those inevitably fragmented liberals or westernized groups. So at least if we don't have 50, at least we'll have 10 parties. And then to try to form coalitions. And the divisions are deep. The divisions between the Coptic liberals and the Muslim liberals is really, really deep. The divisions between the true capitalist business people and the business people who were cronies to Mubarak are very, very, very deep. There are many, many divisions, but at least try to organize them. The United States and the European community should try already anticipating democratic subversion when the Muslim Brotherhood takes over, trying to teach activists how to block state attempts at curtailing Facebook and other interactive modes which empower oppositions against autocratic states. And I think that it would be advisable to prevent bandwagoning for a more assertive United States. Sometimes we forget that the United States in 2004 achieved militarily something that is comparable to the German Blitzkrieg, the 1967 war. It took over Iraq in 3 weeks. The United States has military power. It can use it effectively to show who's the boss, and it doesn't have to do it with troops on the ground. I think that that's an important lesson. I think the Americans should wait in the anticipation that maybe demonstrations will pass, will reach Iran. I think the Libyan precedent of intervention, which is terrible for American interests in Libya because it can only get worse in Libya, but it was a good precedent in the sense that it legitimized intervention which leaves a better, more even playing field between a potential civilian opposition and the state. It should give it time, but after some time, if that doesn't break out, if the demonstrations don't break out, I think the Americans should use massive force, negotiations through bombings, and show the Middle East states and societies who are in a state of tremendous flux, who is the boss. Thank you very much.
Sometimes the conventional wisdom is correct, and in this case, when people are talking about the current crisis in the Middle East, I think it deserves that name. I think this really is the most extraordinary series of events that certainly has happened in my lifetime. I was thinking back about where you can find a comparison with this. One that really comes to mind actually is the 1967 war, which transformed the Middle East in all kinds of ways. And one of the things that happened, if you look at the fact that in 1967, Israel succeeded in a few days accomplishing what the Arabs had thought they had built up in the way of defense. The Arabs were humiliated. The Arabs, in return, turned, first of all, to Islam as the solution to all their problems. And secondly, a lot of changes took place. And so you had a whole new set of rulers that came in on the tail of 1967 war because of the humiliation of their predecessors. And we're still living, those are the people that are getting kicked out right now, basically the people who came in then. That was a real shift. That really transformed the Middle East in an interesting way. An earlier example, which I'm not going to go into, could be 1916, when the Arab world was actually carved up and divided. But I think you have to look at events like that to find predecessors for what is going on today, which is absolutely astonishing. I wrote an article called The Coming Crisis in the Persian Gulf, which unfortunately I don't take great pride in. First of all, because I wrote it in 1997, and following that, about 14 years went by and nothing happened at all. And then when it did begin to happen, it didn't happen the way I thought it would at all. So I don't, but I would offer that, at least the title of that, as an indicator of the fact that a lot of people knew that there were big problems. This was not a secret. There were lots and lots of problems existing in the Arab world and elsewhere that were the basis for this kind of a change. In fact, everybody knew that these emperors had no clothes. That was not a secret at all because of the way they had managed the economy, because of the stultifying foreign policy programs that they pursued, their inability to get anything done, the lack of credibility that they had, the mismanagement of all of their economies, unemployment. It just goes on and on and on. And everybody knew that. What we didn't know was when and how that process would begin to change. And I think we've now seen that, and that in itself. And of course, it was not the it was not Facebook and Twitter and others that made this happen. It was the underlying conditions that existed there at the time. And I would remind you that in the Iranian Revolution, which also moved pretty swiftly, they used cassette tapes. And you had Khomeini sitting off in Paris making periodic statements. Those would be telephoned to Iran, where they would be mass-produced and reproduced, and then handed out in the bazaar. That, we would regard that as an awfully slow and cumbersome way to get your point across. It worked. And in the Soviet Union, they used samizdat, mimeographing papers in little books or big books, and then covertly passing them around to each other. Communications is important, and you can do it a variety of ways, but this was unusual in the fact that it was really fast. And so you could have this exchange of views, people talking about what was going on elsewhere in a matter of seconds, whereas in the past it took a lot longer than that. And I do think that that had the effect. The social networking had a real effect in terms of speeding things up. I think one has to ask, why did these rulers fall so quickly? In many cases, I think it was because after 30 or 40 years in power, they had worked out their little bag of tricks. They knew what worked, and they knew that if there was a challenge, they would just pull out their bag of tricks, and that would take care of it. All of a sudden, they discovered that the tricks didn't work, that people were no longer as afraid as they used to be, and that they were forced to shift. And I think they lost their nerve in many cases. And then in those few cases where we see them not losing their nerve and standing and being prepared to kill their own people, other things happen that intervene. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that. There's a sort of, in fact, we've seen examples of it here in our discussions today. There's a sort of ruling assumption that the only thing that can happen in the Middle East is when somebody from the outside makes it happen, that external intervention is absolutely essential. And to me, the real lesson of what we have seen in this Arab, what some people are calling the Great Arab Awakening or the Arab Spring or what have you, is it was domestic. These were not driven by outside forces. And you can draw various conclusions from this, but what was not on the placards that were being held up in Tahrir Square? They weren't saying Islam is the solution. That was not part of the deal. They were nonviolent. The only violence was coming from their leaders, was coming from the regimes, and that was where it came from. There was no mention of Israel. There was no mention of the United States. Basically, these people had their own agendas. They knew what they were about. They went after it. That doesn't mean that they will get it. And it is absolutely true that revolutions tend to go awry along the way. And I think we have to be prepared for that. That the Arab Spring will turn into an Arab winter. I think this is something that we need to think about. But we have now had two interventions, one in Libya, where the battle is going on currently. The other one was in Bahrain, where Saudi Arabia sent troops across the causeway, along with some other GCC states, to intervene in what was going on in Bahrain because they were worried that the Bahraini government was going to lose its nerve and give in to some of the objectives of the people who were working against them. In effect, the Gulf Cooperation Council has sort of transformed itself into a monarchical protection society, and basically saying that if you are a monarch ruling in the GCC, this little club of rulers in the Gulf, if things start to go bad, we will come in and see to it that nothing changes and that it stays about the way it was. I think it would be a mistake, however, both in Iran and in Egypt and in Libya and all of the other countries that are going on, to sort of come out of this with the conclusion that somehow it's only Iran that was at stake in this thing. I do think that the Saudi intervention was conducted on the grounds that there was a sectarian divide, and the Saudis were terribly afraid of the Shia getting some kind of control of what was going on. And they have, in fact, really turned this into a sectarian conflict in Bahrain. At the beginning, Bahrain had Sunni and Shia together, marching side by side with many of the same with some of the same requests. That is no longer true. The Sunnis now have been intimidated, they're staying home, and this is all being perceived through what I think is an incorrect lens of sectarianism from Saudi Arabia. There's no question that the Saudis themselves are terrified of Iran, and they're terrified of Shia influence. Let me just digress for 1 second to think about where this terrible influence of Iran came from. If you will recall, in 2001, the United States intervened in Afghanistan and did away with Iran's worst enemy to the east, the Taliban. Then before that job was done, we turned around and intervened in Iraq, where we got rid of Iran's worst enemy to the west, which happened to be Saddam Hussein. Then we presided over the installation of a Shia government in Baghdad for the first time in many centuries. And for all of that, the Iranians didn't lift a finger. They didn't do a thing. But at the end of the day, they were in fact left in a position of greater influence in the Gulf and Middle East than they had been within living memory. I've had Iranian friends say, you know, I'm not quite sure why you did this, but we thank you very much. It was very kind of you. I had a discussion one time with a senior American policy official who was involved in that process, and he was railing on about all the terrible things that Iran was doing, and I said, yeah, I agree with you. It doesn't look all that great, but I said, didn't we have something to do with that? And he stopped for a second and he said, well, we didn't mean to. Frankly, I don't think the Arabs buy that this all happened in a fit of absent-mindedness. They remember our relations with the Shah. They remember the Iran-Contra affair, where the United States covertly was trying to open up to Iran and sell arms together with Israel. And those two together, they look at this and they say, oh, you say you just didn't notice that you were doing all of these things. I don't think they believe it. And I think the next opportunity that comes along, they're going to see it as part of an American plot. Let me finish up simply because we haven't really talked about American foreign policy in the Gulf. and American foreign policy generally, I think it is very hard to make any predictions about where things are going to go. I don't think we know. I think we're going to be surprised. But I do believe that we're going to have a different world to deal with. And all of the old assumptions, which a lot of our policies in the Middle East were based on, things like the fact that you could rely on Egypt to take care of the southern border of Gaza, those are not necessarily going to remain true, especially if these countries turn into more democratic states where the voice of the people actually gets heard. It's going to be harder and harder to maintain that. I also think that it's a mistake to think that Iran is going to be the beneficiary of all of this, that it's a zero-sum game and that they're going to come out of it on top. Actually, a lot of the press and support that Ahmadinejad, for instance, has received over the years has been because he was willing to say things, mostly about Israel, that the Arab leaders couldn't say or wouldn't say in public. And people thought that was just dandy. I mean, that was really nifty, and they liked it. Now, if there's going to be governments in place where the voice of the people gets some resonance, I think Iran is going to suffer from that as much as anybody else, that their message is not going to be unique. What do I think is required? I think it's not what's required. I think what's going to happen is that the United States is going to wind down its wars in Iraq and Afghanistan over a relatively short period of time. People are losing interest in those in a major way and are turning away from it. And I think there's going to be, and there needs to be, a sort of zero-based foreign policy analysis based on the new realities in the region, and starting without preconceptions, and starting without the working assumptions that we've worked with, and looking at it with clear eyes without, in fact, wishful thinking. And if that means that the United States is going to have a smaller footprint in the Persian Gulf 10 years from now than it does today, I think it's going to. I think that's going to happen. If you see that as the end of American influence in the world, I think you're wrong. I think that is, the world is changing, and the United States is going to have to change with it. If we don't understand that, our policy in the region is doomed to really greater disasters than we've had to this point. I'm going to stop at that point, and I'm assuming there'll be some questions.
Good day. I'll speak about the nuclear Iran. I'll speak about nuclear Iran. The present turmoil in the Middle East, I'm not sure it's going to bring about a revolutionary effect. But this is a different issue. However, what we see today, it deflects much attention probably from the most important issue in the Middle East, and this is the Iranian quest for a nuclear weapon. Most of the world understands that this combination of a radical Islamist regime with nuclear weapons is not such a great idea. There are many reasons, and I'm not going to elaborate why nuclear Iran is bad news for the region and for the West. And if I try to look what is America doing or what is the West doing, I am quite disappointed. Because what we see today is economic sanctions, which are somewhat less vegetarian than they were maybe a year ago. They definitely have some effect on the Iranian economy, but even if they hurt even more, they will not stop the nuclear quest. Because, do not delude yourself, the regime is determined to get the bomb. The bomb is an insurance policy for the regime. They understand very well that if they get a bomb, they'll be in a much stronger position to resist foreign influence, foreign intervention, just like North Korea or Pakistan. At the height of the Bush crusade for democracy in the Middle East, Pakistan was spared. Why? Because it's a nuclear weapon, and if it's destabilized because of democracy or democratization, there are bad guys there that can put their hands on the bomb. And believe me, in Iran, there are even crazier guys than Ahmadinejad. What do we do? There are some delaying tactics. Sabotage the program. We have Stuxnet. Removal of scientists, which is important because we gain some time. Non-lethal measures are always preferable, but we should not underestimate the ability of the Iranian engineers to fix the problems and to eventually to get the bomb if they will be uninterfered. Another strategy which was not really tried is regime change. There were half-hearted efforts which obviously were not successful. This approach has several weaknesses. First of all, the ability of outsiders to influence domestic events is very limited. And I agree with the remark made by Professor Sick. Apart from that, if we take a look at the opposition in Iran that is demonstrating, those are not the nice guys. They are a different version of the Islamists. Third, and this is something which we do not always realize, suppression, repression works in the Middle East. So therefore, don't hold your breath if we see demonstrations in the streets of Tehran. This is why probably we'll not see change in Syria, in Bahrain, probably in Egypt, because those regimes have a great stake in staying in power. We don't have too many retired presidents in the Middle East. It's a job for life. Having a state is a good business. And the alternative is not always exile. The alternative is to be slaughtered in the streets by the people you tortured a few years ago. The West actually signals weakness, particularly President Obama. Engagement in the Middle East, engagement of the enemies, Syria, Iran, is seen as appeasement. In the Middle East, you don't engage your enemies. You weaken them, you kill them, you don't engage them. Iranians are simply not afraid. And allow me to disturb some of your liberal sensitivities. Fear is the best political currency in the Middle East. Much of the talk in Washington today is about containment. We are told by government officials and some irresponsible academics that Iran, even a nuclear Iran, can be contained. To remind you, the US in February 94 announced by Martin Indixen dual containment. What are the results of American containment of Iran? Did the US stop progress in the Iranian nuclear program? No. Did the US stop Iran from meddling in Afghanistan, Iraq? No. Did the US prevent the buildup of Hezbollah, an Iranian proxy in Lebanon? No. Did US contain Iran influence in Gaza-ruled Hamas? The answer is again no. Did the US contain the rise of the Iran in the Middle East? No. Did the US contain the influence of Iran in Venezuela, in your backyard? No. I'm not sure what the usage of containment is in the English language here in America. Maybe it's appeasement. The Soviet Union was contained in several arenas because there was a clear American commitment to respond militarily. Containment without readiness to use military force does not work. The only time when Iran stopped for a while the nuclear program, weaponization, was when America invaded Iraq in 2003. If the US is not ready to flex its muscles, be it a naval blockade or a military strike, Iran will remain unimpressed. So will be the rest of the Middle East. Actually, only use of force can give containment a chance. Another strategic delusion in Western capitals is that Iran can be easily deterred. Actually, we cannot easily emulate in the Middle East the American-Soviet delicate balance of terror, as it was put quite nicely by Professor Albert Rossiter already in 1957. We are talking about rationality. Yeah, I believe that Iranians are rational. But still, Ahmadinejad talks to the hidden imam. We don't know where he is. He has some epiphany. This is a type of rational people we are ready to deal in a nuclear situation. Also, deterrence depends primarily upon sensitivity to cost. And we know quite well that the Iranians are ready to pay a high price for getting their goals. Furthermore, in nuclear deterrence, what works is an effective second strike. States are not born with second strike capabilities. It takes time to develop them. In the meantime, there is a great pressure to preempt. The command and communication systems in the Middle East are very weak. The distances are very small. A multipolar nuclear Middle East is a strategic nightmare. Actually, only military action, unfortunately, can stop Iran from acquiring a nuclear bomb and strengthen its regime. Only Western military action can reverse the trend of Iranian ascendance in the Middle East and restore Western influence. I know you want to get out of Iraq, you want to get out of Afghanistan. Probably the only way to get out convincingly, without being seen as a dog with his tail between its legs, is to leave those countries with a big bang in Iran. Thank you.
Tough act to follow. I'd like to talk about Iraq and Iran, particularly the nuclear program in Iran. Professor Anbar set me up very well for that. But I'd like to take a little bit of time to talk about Iraq. And the punchline for Iraq is that both in terms of U.S. domestic politics and executive focus, we are unprepared for the future of Iraq, we the United States. Even before the recent events in the Middle East, attention had shifted to Afghanistan, Pakistan, Yemen, a variety of other places. That acceleration has only picked up speed. But at the same time, Iraq hasn't gone away. I mean, I would make an analogy to whack-a-mole, where the United States hits one problem and another pops up, but it's actually worse than that because the moles won't actually stay whacked. And Iraq is not a solved problem. It's a problem that's stabilized, but it's not done. And I'd like to highlight a few reasons why I think, absent continued U.S. involvement on a pretty robust scale after the end of this year, Iraq could go south quite quickly. First is the military weakness of Iraq. It actually looks pretty robust compared to where it was, say, in 2005, but it's quite weak. One example, Iraq does not have an air force capable of controlling its own airspace. It will not by the end of this year. If you talk to senior Iraqi military leaders, this presents them with a little bit of a dilemma, in the sense that if the U.S. really does withdraw, they will not be able to control their own airspace. So the idea that the United States can just split at the end of the year, at least with all uniformed personnel, will leave Iraq without the ability to control its own airspace, which you can think of a variety of situations where that might be problematic. On a deeper level, there's an ongoing weakness with one of the most capable forces in Iraq, the Iraqi Special Operations Forces. These are focused on counterterrorism. They target al-Qaeda in Iraq and other enemies of the Iraqi state. But they have two principal weaknesses. One, they don't have legal basis. These were essentially created by the United States and taken over by Prime Minister Maliki. They are without legal basis. They're run out of his slush fund, essentially. Should there be political change in Iraq, you're looking at a situation where this very capable force could rapidly become delegitimated. On top of that, many Iraqis, particularly Sunnis, but not exclusively Sunnis, see Iraqi Special Operations Forces as Prime Minister Maliki's leg breakers. So they lack both a legal standing and popular legitimacy. So political change of any meaningful sense in Iraq could deprive the United States of its strongest sort of action arm inside Iraq, and also delegitimate continued U.S. Special Operations activity in Iraq, which, by the way, will continue after the end of this year, if quite quietly. So that's one potential serious problem. Another is the problem of the supplies the United States is giving to Iraq. Iraq is buying some pretty sophisticated U.S. military hardware, particularly the M1 tank. It's quite a nice tank, but in the words of one U.S. logistician, without support, it becomes the world's most expensive and heaviest paperweight. And unfortunately, Iraq is not going to be up to the logistics challenge in terms of maintaining that. So without U.S. troops, they'll have to look for some other solution. One solution that's proposed is contractors. Have U.S. contractors come in, do the maintenance, etc. The problem with that, and it works in other countries, the problem with that for Iraq is not Saudi Arabia. It's not nearly as stable as Saudi is. And of course, as we've seen, even apparently stable regimes can go south quite quickly. So it's going to be, I think, unusually challenging to find contractors at General Dynamics or wherever who will want to base themselves on a permanent basis in Iraq in order to maintain Iraq's nice, shiny new fleet of M1 tanks. Without that, as I said, this is going to be a logistical nightmare. So a lot of the stuff that we're selling to Iraq that's above the level of small arms may be potentially useless without ongoing U.S. involvement. There's also the question of politicization in the military and intelligence services in Iraq. In the military, many division-level commanders and probably below division-level commanders are associated with one political party or another. Several are associated with the two main Kurdish parties. Some are associated with Sunni parties in Anbar. Some are associated with different Shia parties. But the point is there's a strong element of politicization. This is not terribly surprising given how politicized Saddam's military was. But between that and overall corruption, military effectiveness and the potential for fragmentation of the military can't be understated. So there's the potential, if there's some major conflict either on the borders or inside Iraq, that you could see the military begin to fragment. The intelligence services in Iraq aren't any better. You have the Iraqi National Intelligence Service, which was built up by the Central Intelligence Agency. In order to compete with that explicitly, there's been the creation of the Ministry of State for National Security Affairs, which is seen as a counterweight to the alleged CIA-influenced INIS. And there's the potential for that kind of covert rivalry to continue as well. So this is not only the potential for fragmentation, but also limits intelligence collection and intelligence sharing. The United States has been able to mitigate some of these shortfalls in intelligence and has been able to provide some level of oversight and ensure some level of sharing in the Iraqi intelligence community. Without continued U.S. involvement on a pretty major scale, I think this is just going to get worse. And finally, you have the question of the Sons of Iraq, who were former insurgents and tribesmen who signed up for a paramilitary program initially under the United States, later taken over by the Iraqi state. At their peak, there were about 100,000 of these, principally but not exclusively Sunni fighters. In Baghdad, there were about 50,000. Many of them have been transitioned, but at least 30 to 40,000 in other parts of Iraq have not. There's an ongoing question of what's going to happen to them. There's a potential they could return to violence, at least if you believe the newspaper. Many are filtering back into al-Qaeda in Iraq and other terrorist organizations. So I think anybody that follows the very back pages of the newspapers these days will see that there's still a steady drumbeat of violence in Iraq. The political situation has not resolved itself, and the United States is, by and large, going to have to retain a role there. We're just simply unprepared for this. There is no publicly stated plan, though if you listen to Beltway gossip, there's probably a plan somewhere in the bowels of the Pentagon or down in Tampa at CENTCOM to maintain a U.S. presence after 2011. But, as Professor Quant and Professor Sick have both pointed out, there's not really a domestic consensus in the United States to do that. I think one can be built, in part because the body count will be quite low for such a mission. It's already dropped off to almost nothing. It can continue at that level. But absent an effort and a focus by the executive branch in particular to build that consensus, I think the United States really could be out of Iraq at the end of 2011 with fairly disastrous consequences. I'll talk briefly about Iran. I agree with many of the points that Professor Inbar made. Covert action has made a lot of progress, but as we saw with the Iraqi case in Osirak in the 1970s and early 1980s, it will buy a fairly limited delay, but it will not stop a determined program. So that leaves some crummy options. As he points out, deterrence is never certain. It rests on both a secure second strike and a willingness to dialogue in crisis. And he concludes that military action is a necessity. I think military action can be remarkably successful in the short to medium term. We can talk about that in Q&A. I don't believe the stories that there are vast legions of hidden Iraqi scientists working in a vast underground complex that's unobservable, and therefore you will get minimal effect from military action. Military action can buy you a delay of some years, maybe even 5 years, but it can't end the program. We saw that with Osirak. It bought a 10-year delay, but it did not end Iraq's nuclear ambitions, and they had come quite far in the intervening decade. So, some people argue maybe you just have to mow the lawn, so to speak. Every 5, 3, 10, however many years, you launch another strike on Iranian nuclear facilities. And maybe they bury them a little deeper each time, maybe they hide them a little better, but you can find them, you can hit them, and particularly if the U.S. does it. The United States has vast air assets that have their limitations, but for blowing up fixed targets are quite robust. The problem with this is if you fail at mowing the lawn, you may have actually made the deterrence problem much worse. And I say this because Iran will be incentivized not to have what some people call a recessed arsenal, which Israel is alleged to have at this time. That is to say, an arsenal that's not fully assembled, ready to go at a moment's notice. Instead, Iran, having been pretty substantially poked in the eye on their program before, will want to deploy. I think this will put a lot of pressure on Israel to sort of come out of the closet and deploy an arsenal as well. And as Professor Inbar points out, neither one of these will be a terribly secure second strike. Israel could probably be a lot further along than Iran, but the point is there will be a premium on preemption on both sides. And as various Israeli activities have shown, there's already a bit of a proclivity to preempt in the Israeli military strategic culture. So in a crisis that emerges in a post-military strike crisis between Iran and Israel, you have the potential for actually driving up the preemption on both sides, because Iran will know its arsenal is vulnerable. And if you know your arsenal is vulnerable, you have a real use or lose incentive. So while I think military action can be very effective in the short to medium term, it runs the risk of making the long-term problem much less tractable. Thanks. All right, we have a microphone, and please come up, and we'll do questions one at a time, just because I'm a bit dopey and lose track.
Ronald Hellman. So 3 points. First, one of the coins of the political science realm in modern times is that democracies don't go to war against democracies. Looking at empirical evidence, it's a fairly strong case. So my first question is, if that is a valid hypothesis, would that not be a very compelling reason for Israel to look to the changes that are dramatic changes that are taking place now in their neighborhood as, in the end, beneficial, because it would, in a sense, validate or not validate that political science hypothesis? The second question has to do with the footprint that Professor Sick had raised about possibly reducing the footprint. It seems to me that President Obama is trying to deal with what maybe one could call some collateral repair as opposed to collateral damage in the international system by stressing cooperation, multilateralism, negotiations, etc., etc. So I was wondering to what extent that initiative bears on the size of the footprint that we are going to witness from now and into the future. And my third is more of a comment more than a question, has to do with some quaint old-fashioned ideas in foreign policy in the United States, things like multi-party, bipartisanism, non-intervention, self-determination, all of those kinds of things. Where do we stand with regard to the need or not to have the need to kind of reconstruct the sense of bipartisan foreign policy in this country, and as well as the role that our friends and partners in the rest of the world, and particularly in the Middle East, play, that we move in that direction rather than we move in a perpetually increasing partisanized policy stance internationally. So those are the three issues: democracy, internationalism, and partisanism.
Could we sort of enhance the possibilities of, of increasing the volume? Because it's very hard.
Sure. Can we get AV? Can we get the volume turned up on the mic? So, well, that mic as much as anything. So, yeah, make sure that mic's on. Go ahead. Gary, do you want to respond?
To take more questions.
We got 3 on the table. Let's answer those, then we'll get to the next.
Will democracy help Israel in the Middle East? I think we don't know, but since I think something like that is probably coming, maybe Israel would be well advised to try to make the best of it, rather than saying any kind of change in the leadership or the authoritarian traditions of these countries. Any change in that is going to be bad for Israel. I'm not sure that's true. I'm not sure it's going to be Pollyannish and simply say that if there's more freedom of expression in Egypt or some other country, that necessarily is going to work to Israel's benefit. I think it's likely to work to Israel's benefit in the long run. I think there's going to be a lot of objection in the short run because a lot of the old assumptions, and this is what I was talking about, basically, that we have a bunch of assumptions that we have just become very accustomed to about what kinds of things we can expect from Egypt or other countries, and probably those are going to change. And if we say, oh, we can't let them change, I think, talk about being on the wrong side of history. You really are going to be on the wrong side of history. And I think that fits the United States as well as it does Israel. That basically, and this goes to the second point about the internationalism and the like, the United States, we can talk all we like about the United States has to throw its weight around and show them who's boss and be tough and be prepared to intervene. Well, tell the American people that. Maybe it suits the strategic interests of a number of parties, both in this country and in other countries in the Middle East, but that doesn't make it happen. And I think the reality is that any kind of internationalist approach or balancing of power, instead of the U.S. coming in and doing it all, that a balance of power is probably going to emerge. Whether we like it or not, that's going to be an efficient, effective way of taking care of your business. And how that fits in terms of a bipartisan foreign policy, I don't know, except that right now, if you really wanted to divide the American electorate even more than it has been, try going to war with another country in the Middle East.
About the democratic peace, well, one of Columbia University's most influential professors points out, Jack Snyder points out that new democracies, if what will emerge will be democratic, tend to make war more than peace. In other words, the democratic peace is true of very mature democracies. Let's not forget the First World War, maybe the worst war ever, was between at least nominally democratic states. So this is the argument made by a prominent political scientist who works in this building. We also tend to forget how long revolutionary situations play out. I mean, usually it takes at least 10 years before things get better, even in the most successful revolutionary situations. Poland and Hungary achieved economic levels, socioeconomic levels of the last years of communism after 10 years of massive infusions of aid from the European community and the United States, a type of envelopment that the states in the Middle East will never get. And third point about the democratic peace is that Freedom House now is pointing out to a regression in democratization the world over in the last 4 or 5 years. Becoming democratic is a very, very difficult business. Usually revolutionary situations yield lost generations. Terrible, terrible experiences. It usually begins with the meanest taking over, then civil war, and then foreign intervention or international war. We can't allow our hearts to overcome our minds. Now, regarding internationalism, offshore balancing, you know, every time in the IR community, Mearsheimer and Waldheimer Mearsheimer and Walt, you know, they always say, instead of an offensive American posture, we should do offshore balancing. Offshore balancing with who? Iran is now being more and more supported by the second powerhouse, Turkey, which is becoming more and more anti-Western, and in many ways maybe anti-democratic. That's very problematic. And the American public, finally, regarding I know very little about American politics, but being successful, being strong, is good for American business as well. And it's an American interest.
On bipartisanship, I'll just say that I've been struck by how much continuity there's been between some aspects of Bush foreign policy and Obama's foreign policy, and pretty remarkable coherence. I mean, if anything, particularly on counterterrorism stuff, Obama has turned it up from where Bush was, and with the support of a Republican Congress. I mean, there are very few things you can get the Republicans and Democrats to agree on, but some aspects, particularly the more, shall we say, muscular aspects of U.S. foreign policy, there's been agreement. Now, I think that may peter out when it comes, as Gary says, to starting another war. But a lot of ways, there is remarkable bipartisan foreign policy consensus. It tends to be more center-right than to the left, though. Please.
Joe Blady, given its current drift, what sort of problems could Turkey pose for U.S. policy going forward? And is it conceivable that Turkey's membership in NATO would ever become untenable?
We'll take another one. Go ahead.
It's my understanding, I know I read this a while back, that either it's been developed or is on the verge of being developed, the largest bunker busting bomb, which has capability against subterranean facilities, could in Iran. You have the drawdown of troops in Iraq and Afghanistan, and I think an eventual realization that sanctions are not working. And I just wanted to ask the panel what they believe is the prognosis down the road in view of these things for military intervention in Iran.
All right, one more.
Hello, my name is Mark Garan. I sort of subscribe to the duck interpretation of international foreign policy. If it quacks like a duck, looks like a duck, it should be a duck. Now, looking at American Middle Eastern policy right now, what it appears to me, and this is in effect, we are overthrowing one by one all national secular regimes in the Arab Middle East and replacing them with Muslim Brotherhood or derivative regimes in the name of democracy, freedom, and reform. Now, I think this panel has to treat seriously the question, is this a blunder, a folly, or an actual conscious policy? Now, having said that, I want to go back a little bit to the Turkish example with which I'm especially familiar. Now, we're aware of the agenda established by Graham Fuller, Professor Fuller, in the late 90s and publicized by the RAND Corporation regarding democratic Islam, moderate Islam, and that Turkey would become an example and a model for this, and then that would be applied to other countries in the name of stability, peace, and so forth. The question here, is democratization really Islamization? Are we talking Orwellian here?
Okay,
That sort of covers it.
Thank you. All right. Panelists? Please.
I'll say a few words about Turkey, which has attracted much of my academic work. Turkey is clearly deviating from NATO standard behavior. And to give you just a few examples, it is only NATO countries that invited Ahmadinejad. Turkey is the only country that invited the butcher from Khartoum to visit Turkey. It voted against the United States at the United Nations Security Council on the Iranian sanction resolution. It is getting cozy with Putin. Actually, Putin and Erdogan are a bird of the same feather. It is siding with Hamas, not with the PA. I can understand they have a soft spot for Palestinians, but siding with Hamas is weakening the PA, is weakening Abbas, the moderate. It's siding with Hezbollah, and domestically, what we see is that this government actually erodes human rights. There is no longer an independent judiciary, and actually we see a lot of concern among the liberals in Turkey about the future of this country. Turkey is, of course, not a small, insignificant country. Turkey is almost 80 million people with an imperial history in the Middle East, and it's a rising power. Actually, the behavior of Turkey is changing the balance of power in the Middle East because it has gravitated toward Iran. I would suggest to NATO to be very careful in sharing sensitive information with Turkey, because you cannot know if this information will reach Iran. The Turks have also tried to impede the NATO missile program in Eastern Europe and in Turkey. So Turkey is very bad news. And there is a window of opportunity. In June, they have elections. And I think America and the West should make clear that Erdogan's behavior and his government is unacceptable in the West. Because otherwise the message that goes to the liberal circles in Turkey is that America is supporting Islamization of Turkey. This is how they are reading it, and they get desperate. Those elections are crucial for the future of Turkey. About Iran, an attack of Iran, in my view, on the nuclear installations would need the insertion of a small amount of ground troops in order to make sure that what has to be destroyed is indeed destroyed. I think it can be done. For Israel, it's a bit more difficult. Actually, Austin Long wrote the famous article about the ability of the Israeli Air Force to get there in international security. I'm sure we can get there. It's more difficult to come back.
Hi. I'd like to address this to Mr. Frisch and Mr. Imbar. When you were talking about the fear of Egypt being militarized by Iran, I was wondering if you were considering 3 points. First of all, the Egyptian military is not just a military in Egypt. It's a very big part of the Egyptian government. It owns massive amounts of real estate besides other things. And it was considered a moderating influence in the recent uprising. Secretary of State Clinton praised the military's behavior, and she said that it was due mainly to the fact that the U.S. military trained them. That's my first point. Secondly, about cafe
do you have a question
society, in that New York Times article that you were reading, I read it also, okay? And what he said was that many Egyptian political liberals over all the years used to meet in the coffee shops and talk politics. And when the authoritarian...
I need to hear a question.
Huh?
Can you get to your question?
Yes, I want to ask him if he agrees with these points. And when the authoritarian
that's actually not a question. Just
when the
get to the
authoritarian
question.
elements found this out, they closed up the coffee shops. And the Muslim Brotherhood was the only group that lasted because they met in the mosques and they couldn't close the mosques. And my third point is Professor Dabashi of Columbia University recently wrote a book about the Shiites. And he said the Shiites are mainly a protest movement, and when they garner power, it usually fizzles out. Thank you.
There wasn't a question. So if you want to address any of those points.
I'll just talk about the Turkish model and marketing. About the Turkish model, first of all, we don't know whether the Turkish model is really in the direction of democracy or it's going to Islamicize. But many say that the Egyptians will follow the Turkish model or the Indonesian model, which the American administration has presumably studied. There's a crucial difference between the reality in Egypt today and in Turkey. In Turkey, there were two, at least very highly institutionalized parties, and remain to this day, the Republican Party and the Nationalist Party, which has existed since 1969 in its present form, and which dates back to the 1940s, even older. These are two institutionalized parties that can always be some kind of counterweight to Islamization. In Egypt, there is no institutional counterweight to the Muslim Brotherhood. There's nothing. There's nothing unless Mubarak's former party, the National Democratic Party, will resurrect itself under another name. And that's very questionable. About the military being moderate, certainly the military is more moderate. The military remembers what happened to the Iranian military in the Iranian Revolution, where the people, many of the generals were slaughtered and killed, and those who and those who escaped that kind of fate were sent to the battlefields with unprepared troops against Iraq. So they certainly will try avoiding a Muslim Brotherhood outcome. But as I said, revolutionary situations are usually disastrous sequels. The meanest and the most organized take over, then there's civil war, and then there's foreign intervention. I think the military, which is pretty weak, will be strong enough to create a civil war, but will not be strong enough to prevent a Muslim takeover, simply because there will be elections. There is going to be elections, and the military can't run as a political party.
I'll just say this on the notion, which is pretty common, that somehow contact with the U.S. military pacifies or makes more respectful of human rights or whatever. I think this is, at best, an untested hypothesis, and at worst, a canard. I have a lot of friends that teach at U.S. professional military institutions. They have students who come from many of the militaries we're talking about, not just Egypt. I don't get the sense from them, and I don't get the sense from interacting with some of these students that it's much more than a chance to hang out in the U.S. for a year. I don't feel that they imbibe in some deep, meaningful way U.S. values. I mean, it takes a long time to inculcate values in U.S. personnel, often starting at a very young age. Coming to a war college or special forces school or whatever for a year or 6 weeks or whatever is not really going to cut it. So I wouldn't believe the hype on that one.
Oh, could I just add one point, since I did write maybe the only article ever on the relationship between religion and Arab armies. I used the official journals, the official army journals of each respective state, Egypt, Syria, and Jordan. The Egyptian army is deeply religious. This is how the official state wanted to represent it. One of the chief incentives to get people to join is that if you become an NCO, your Hajj is subsidized. In other words, when I compared the Egyptian army, for instance, to the Syrian army, the Egyptian army is truly religious. And I think this is one of the problems. The officer class doesn't trust the rank and file. I think the rank and file is probably very religious, and some of them very pro-Muslim Brotherhood, which is one of the reasons why the military has been trying to appease the Muslim Brotherhood. They took a man by the name of Tariq al-Bishri, a Muslim Brotherhood constitutionalist, to head the committee for the amendments of the Constitution upon which there was a referendum. And the Coptics and other liberals were furious with this appointment.
Hi, I was just wondering if Western intervention in Egypt, whether indirectly through the attempts to unite these liberal parties, or directly, if it comes to it, through a naval blockade or sending in ground troops, if that could be viewed by Arabs in the region as another example of the West attempting to deter self-determination in the region, in the same vein as U.S. support for the regime in Egypt, the CIA-sponsored Iranian coups, British installation of Emir Faisal as a puppet monarch in Iraq, and French suppression of Syrian revolts, and whether, if that is the case, if that could serve to radicalize the response in the region from actors such as the Muslim Brotherhood towards the West.
We'll take another one. Go ahead.
Hi, my name is Martin Wilner. I want to ask a question about the U.S. arms export economy and its role in the Middle East policy. Based on the recent level of uncertainty there, what do you see the future U.S. arms export economy to look like? And in particular, do you see any arms sales increasing to any countries in the region based on the levels of uncertainty?
Well, on the arms arms sales, I don't worry about that very much. I think we can probably survive with our economy. It isn't reliant on the sale of arms. And believe me, uncertainty does breed arms sales. And so I will not be at all surprised if we have big arms sales contracts with Iraq as it begins to go. They don't have an air force. Well, we'll sell them an air force. There's a lot of places where that can go. So I don't see this as, I see nothing on the horizon that suggests that that part of the economy is going to suffer because of the uncertainty in the Middle East. And as I say, I'm not sure that matters very much in terms of where either the Middle East or the U.S. goes. Let me make one statement, make one point with regard to the very great sense of urgency that I hear from both the panel and from people elsewhere about the Iranian nuclear program. There was, I recall a speech made by someone you may have heard of named Netanyahu in making the statement that if the United States doesn't intervene, Iran is going to have a nuclear weapon in 3 to 5 years. That statement was made to the Knesset in 1992. And ever since that time, and not just because he said it, the threat of a nuclear weapon in Iran's hands has been 3 to 5 years away, and it is still. That is the latest U.S. military, that's the latest U.S. intelligence estimate, that Iran is 3 to 5 years away from a nuclear weapon. My question really is, if Iran so desperately needs and wants a nuclear weapon, what has been holding them back? That's a long time. It's almost 20 years. And in that process, they now have more low-enriched uranium than they had before. Very true. They've probably done some tabletop experiments. We caught them at it, basically figuring out how you would build a weapon that would fit on a missile. But they don't have a weapon. And the idea that somehow the only way one can deal with this desperate, urgent threat is for the United States, not anybody else, for the United States to go in, bomb them, and then, of course, put some boots on the ground, because you've got to determine what actually happened with the bombing raids, and that's the only way you can determine it. That is, there are American generals who are proposing this solution. I don't find any American politicians supporting this, and I think that they're not going to. And that basically, if I were running on a platform, if anybody was running on a platform in this country, in which that was their basic plank about their policy in the Middle East, we're going to get tough, we're going to throw our weight around, we're going to show them who's boss, and we're going to bomb Iran and put boots on the ground there, I would not give that person a very strong chance of becoming president. Now, we can talk all we like about our interpretation of what needs to be done, but I've been struck by the fact that it's all about how the U.S. is supposed to do these things. And we're being, given a lot of suggestions about what we ought to do. I wonder about that. And I wonder whether, in fact, this is going to in fact, affect U.S. strategy in any significant way. And I think we really have to keep that in mind, both the urgency of the thing and the fact of what the political realities are.
I'll just respond to the idea of intervention, of American intervention in Egypt, and maybe what that could arouse. Now, it's simple. There's an organ, an Arab press organ of the Iranians called Al-Wifaq. And in Al-Wifaq, they made the point that they are going to support the demonstrators, the revolutionaries, call them what you want, of course not the Democrats, that's the one word they didn't use, in Egypt. Now, this is the same Iranian regime, this is a regime organ, that suppressed the Democrats just 10 months ago. So when they say they will support the Egyptian demonstrators, who are they referring to? Of course, they're referring to the Muslim Brotherhood. And it's clear to Egyptians as well that since Iranians are going to be supporting the Muslim Brotherhood, and they're going to be pumping a lot of money into the coming elections, most Egyptians on the posts expect that the United States and the European community will be involved in propping up the other side. And this is what's going to, and in the potential civil war after the elections, that's probably how it's going to fall. The Iranians will support the Muslim Brotherhood as they support Hamas in Hamastan in Gaza, and the Americans and European community are going to support the opposing side. Let me remind you that there were American forces in the Bolshevik Revolution who supported the White Russians.
I don't think there is great difference between the assessment of the Israeli intelligence and the American intelligence about the progress of the nuclear program. I think they may differ a year or two, which, you know, in historic terms really doesn't mean much. The sense of urgency is indeed much greater in our part of the world, and it's not only Jerusalem, it's also in Riyadh and in Cairo, which, true, I agree with you that the Americans don't seem to share it. I must say that the argument about, what is electable here as a measure for good policy in the Middle East is not very convincing. Once you voted good presidents, less good presidents, I'm a great believer in democracy, but democracies can make mistakes. And I think that America made once in a while mistakes despite being the greatest democracy in the world. So, there is strategic judgment and there are political outcomes. I'm talking about strategic realities rather than what is electable here or politically wise to propose to the American people. We definitely see a strategic fatigue on part of the United States about, giving you advice. I think that Israel has been very good at doing the dirty job for Americans on several occasions. Just to remind you, the Syrian reactor, I saw the Iraqi reactor. I don't think that if we'd have allowed this to happen, it would have been a good outcome. So sometimes Americans, for their reason, don't want to do it. Then we have no choice but to do it. By the way, I think that the moment of decision in Israel is getting closer, precisely because, it's not 5 years ago, it's 2 years now. I agree that it put some question mark on, on the intelligence services, and, the intelligence services do not always know everything. But they are advancing, that's quite clear, and I think that the nonchalant attitude toward the nuclear Iran is very problematic, to put it at least. About Western intervention. Western intervention cannot do the trick in the Middle East. Only domestic developments. There are certain things that you can prevent by intervention, basically trying to limit capabilities to harm you. This is a policy I advocate to my government. You should try to do only a very modest policy. Try to limit the capabilities of your enemies to harm you. I think a nuclear Iran can harm the United States as well. And I hope the Americans will understand it.
I think that's it. We'll close out with a round of applause and be back in